Chris, this is the 2000th ever episode of Newscast.
That is extraordinary because it doesn't seem long ago since we were marking. Now, would it have been the 1500th or the 1000th? Either it was a big landmark anyway. Do we just do more of them now?
We've done a lot of anniversaries.
We like to celebrate our birthdays or whatever they are. 2000. That's a whole lot of verbiage, isn't it?
And in keeping with the 1999 preceding episodes, this is a completely unplanned extra episode where we've assembled to do some breaking news that we weren't expecting to do, and so we're just going to see what happens.
Terrific.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio for the 2000th time.
And it is Chris at Westminster wondering if we'll reach 3,000 by...
This week?
What do we think? Yeah, April?
I mean, at the rate the news works these days, you never know.
Exactly.
Where actually did you begin the day of the 2000th episode of Newscast?
So I woke up in fantastic Pontypridd in the valleys of South Wales, about 12 miles north of Cardiff. Had a lovely run before dawn this morning. And we were out and about making some pieces about the Senedd elections coming up to the Welsh Parliament in May, which is going to be fascinating. Labour under kind of colossal pressure. And then we were in a community centre in Merthyr Tydfil talking to a great bunch of folk about, life in contemporary Wales and how they find things and how they're thinking about things politically and all of that. And news reached us. And that was a useful reminder for nerds like us that, news of this political magnitude doesn't necessarily shake every blade of grass in every corner of the UK. I'm not saying people weren't interested in it, but, there are magnitudes of these things. But then suffice to say, after my great chat with them, which we'll broadcast at some point, but not today, as it turns out, it was a mad scramble back to Westminster.
And we covered quite comprehensively all the events of this morning. For example, Kemi Badenoch's social media video where she said she'd uncovered Robert Jenrick's plot to defect away from the Conservatives, causing as much damage to his Tory colleagues as possible. And then we looked at some of the potential implications and the fact that Nigel Farage had already done one press conference today where he was keeping quite stum about what was going on. So if you want to hear in great detail how it felt kind of at lunchtime on Thursday, then you can listen to the previous episode of Newscast, which is in your feeds. But this episode, we're going to bring you right bang up to date. We're recording at 6:30 on Thursday evening. So we've had Nigel Farage's second press conference of the day, Chris, which is at 4:30.
Yeah, so I scrambled from Paddington Station in London to Reform HQ in Westminster and arrived in the nick of time. And the thing is, we were in Reform's relatively new HQ, and it's quite a swanky HQ, but the room that they have for news conferences is quite small. And they were planning a news conference. We've known about it for the last couple of days. In fact, Nigel Farage reckoned it was part of the building blocks of the case the Conservatives made to themselves about Robert Jenrick's imminent defection, even though Reform argued that it wasn't imminent until Kemi Badenoch slightly sort of pushed it in the direction of happening. They were going to be doing a news conference about the cancellation of various local elections in England in May, which is newsy today, no doubt about it, but not quite on the magnitude news-wise of Robert Jenrick's defection. So we all pile in. I must admit, I am still wearing my thermals, which were very much for, trudging around in the streets of South Wales in January, where it's not exactly kind of Mediterranean.
Oh, you must have been boiling in that tiny room.
And I was sweating buckets in there because we were properly squeezed in. You couldn't help but read the contents of the screen of the laptop of the person next to you. It's a pretty pathetic excuse for reading somebody else's stuff, isn't it? But that's the truth. We're all sort of rammed in there. And there's cameras, and then there's photographers crawling on all fours, like a toddler or a baby before a toddler, like a baby might do, to try and get their angles and all the rest of it. And then the extraordinary moment, because this is the thing, and no doubt you reflected on this at lunchtime, but there's two things around today, which is kind of classic Westminster, if you like. You have the sort of human drama, the farce, the skullduggery, the foul-ups. And then you have, and we can get to this, what it means for British politics, what it means for the right of British politics. And the news conference that I was at a couple of hours ago as we record
was all of those things.
Was all of those things. So it was the farce of it, of us all crammed into the room. There was incoming Nigel Farage doing a bit of a spiel and talking about what he thought he'd be talking about and then what he's actually talking about. And then the most extraordinary moment, I just love these moments because it's a reminder of the sort of human drama at the heart of politics and the heart of the stories, if you like, of those who lead us or aspire to lead us. So the big moment, the big reveal, there was a lot of news around this at lunchtime, but actually the pivotal moment of today
Well,
was...
actually, why don't we let newscasters listen to it?
That's a good idea.
Because here is Nigel
Here we
Farage
go.
unveiling his star new signing over quite a long period of time.
And on that note, I will welcome Robert Jenrick into this room and into Reform UK. Oh, he hasn't changed his mind, has he? We can't find him. Is he coming, Nick? It's been a funny... This would be a very funny end of the day, wouldn't it?
And even that moment, which presumably was just Robert Jenrick being in a room down a corridor and maybe just doing some finishing touches to something and then making his way to the podium, even that has become contested at Westminster today. Like, what was happening in that moment?
Yes, because the Conservatives, just prior to Robert Jenrick's anticipated arrival in the room, had put out some of the stuff, some of their evidence, if you like, that had led them to the conclusion this morning that they would throw him out of the shadow cabinet and the party and all the rest of it. In other words, some of the anticipated speech that he would give when he defected. And the Conservatives have suggested that the reason he was late to his own defection is that he was rewriting part of that speech. Now, any questions to Robert Jenrick around the kind of process? I mean, process is probably to dignify it with a greater sort of sense of being thought through than it was hour by hour today. But any kind of question to Robert Jenrick about the kind of process of today was sort of brushed away as being insignificant. But the drama of him being, yeah, as I say, late to his own defection rather underlined that sense of how today had come about and how clearly it had come about vastly faster than any of the key players were anticipating. And at the heart of it, and I guess you may have some of the clips from the news conference that you might play, Adam, but at the heart of it for me was a bit of a, if you're not a contradiction, then certainly a curiosity. So you had Nigel Farage saying in the news conference that he thought, you know, if you'd asked him this morning what the likelihood was of Robert Jenrick defecting, it would have been 60-40 in favour of him joining.
Because they've been talking since September.
Exactly. But 60-40 isn't much greater than the toss of a coin in terms of proportion or likelihood. And yet there was Robert Jenrick at 5 o'clock this evening with this thought through demolition of a party that he woke up this morning a member of, including a kind of drive-by on individual members of the shadow cabinet, the table around which he sat for a meeting of that shadow cabinet yesterday. And so you think, so either, you know, it's all happened rather quickly and it could still have been months away. And there's something in that, I think. And/or he has rushed to a decision that he wasn't quite ready to make, and yet he was of this disparaging view of so many of his own colleagues while sitting around a table with them as recently as this week, and was an away day for the Conservative Party, I'm told, last week, where they were talking about election strategy and all sorts of things that you'd expect a party to do when they get together in private. And there he was, I am told by Conservatives, and you might say they would say this, wouldn't they, but making copious notes, etc., etc. Nothing wrong with that when you're the Shadow Justice Secretary, but raises a few eyebrows when a few days later you're saying that you want Nigel Farage to be the next Prime Minister.
So Robert Jenrick was found by Reform UK. He was ushered to the lectern where Nigel Farage had been speaking a few minutes before. And then with Nigel Farage sat at a table to his left-hand side, Robert Jenrick then launched into, as what you described there, Chris, a demolition of the Conservative Party now, in the past, in the future, including criticism of some of his former colleagues.
The Conservative Party needed to change fundamentally, starting by acknowledging the state of Britain and owning up to the role we played in getting Britain to this point. I respect Kemi, but on all those issues, we were in different places. Let me be clear, they've doubled down. I can't kid myself anymore. The party hasn't changed, and it won't. The bulk of the party don't get it. They don't have the stomach for the radical change that Britain needs. In opposition, it's easy to paper over these cracks, but the divisions, the delusions are still there. And if we don't get the next government right, Britain will likely slip beyond the point of repair. everything is on this. Everything is on this decision. I can't, in good conscience, stick with a party that's failed so badly, that isn't sorry, that hasn't changed, that I know in my heart can't deliver what's needed. That is why I resolved to leave.
And also, Chris, the colleagues that he mentioned by name were Mel Stride, who's now the Shadow Chancellor. But Robert Jenrick said when he was the Work and Pension Secretary in the previous government, he'd failed to get a grip of the burgeoning welfare bill, which he now criticises from opposition. And Robert Jenrick also pointed the finger at Priti Patel, currently Shadow Foreign Secretary, previously the Home Secretary. And he said that she was responsible for, or partly responsible for, the huge wave of immigration that came in after COVID under Boris Johnson. And also that she was sort of in denial about any responsibility for it. And then he talked about this moment and the discussion they'd had in the Shadow Cabinet. Maybe it was the meeting they had yesterday where they talked about, do we think Britain is broken? And he said he was one of the few people in the room that said, yes, it is. Everyone else said, no, it wasn't. And so that has now become Conservative Party policy. And then he said there was a third group of people who said, yeah, it is, but we can't say it is because we're the ones that broke it.
Yeah, and
it was a long list of gripes.
It was, and that emptying out in public in front of the cameras of the sort of thing that us reporters will attempt to get and sometimes piece together from background chats that we have with folk. But this was, of course, a moment of defection is a moment that the figures in the departing party will regard as treachery. And the argument that sometimes the defector will make is that, they're true to their principles and their previous party has changed or whatever. What struck me about Robert Jenrick in that news conference was that he decided to go much, much further than you might argue is necessary. He would argue he was just being authentic and reflecting his authentic frustrations with his now former party. But he chose to go much, much further than he might have done, and in particular chose to personalise his critique around some of the folk who he sat around the Shadow Cabinet table with just yesterday. And there's a wider point, I think, Adam, which is this. He was critical of some of those individuals. He was critical of some other Conservative MPs as well, which makes you wonder how viable, his leadership of the Conservative Party would have been if he'd beaten Kemi Badenoch to the job. Now, he might argue his, shadow cabinet would have looked rather different, but he was still very critical about where, if not the centre of gravity, then certainly the views of quite a lot of Conservative colleagues were relative to where he is. So I just think that's interesting, given how recently he was seeking to be a Conservative leader. And then there is the question of what Nigel Farage chooses to do with Robert Jenrick, what Robert Jenrick himself chooses to do within reform. The parliamentary moments won't be as frequent because they are a very small parliamentary party. And then Nigel Farage has to wrestle with this, and it's becoming a cliche, but it's a cliche because there's something in it as a critique of where reform are, that, this critique that they are the Conservatives 2.0, because there was this burst pipe of Conservatives heading in reform's direction, including ones who were in the last Conservative government that was turfed out spectacularly. And that is increasingly tricky, I think, for Nigel Farage. He said intriguingly today, and he is the master of creating intrigue because that throws forward a momentum around attention. He said intriguingly today that next week, I think next Tuesday, they are planning to unveil a Labour defector. Again, let's see who it is and of what seniority, etc., etc. And he did point out, and I had noticed this yesterday, and it's just intriguing. Yesterday, they had a defection from the Green Party from a council, a local authority councillor. So that they're trying to begin to make an argument about the sort of breadth of their appeal, but it is undeniably true that it points principally in one direction at the moment, and that is arguably limiting. But as I've said before, again, because I think it's a reasonable judgment, that kind of Conservative 2.0 critique or whatever from Nigel Farage's perspective is a nice problem to have. Doesn't mean it's not a difficult problem, but it is a nice problem to have because the momentum, the magnetism of reform, particularly from former Conservatives, is real, and that is quite a thing to witness when when you think of the pedigree and the previous scale and the history of the Conservative Party. And right now it is hemorrhaging on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, names towards reform. So that kind of remoulding of the British right happening before our eyes.
What about this theory doing the rounds that Robert Jenrick was very ambitious and he'd realised that his previous plan he may have had to challenge Kemi Badenoch for the leadership after potentially disappointing results for the Conservatives in May, that was receding because Kemi Badenoch's performances and her reputation was improving, and so that door was closing to him?
That's certainly an analysis I have heard from various Conservatives privately this afternoon, including some who liked Robert Jenrick, were loyal to Robert Jenrick, and had backed Robert Jenrick in the leadership race. That, he had a certain momentum perhaps in the first year or so, perhaps a little under the first year of Kemi Badenoch's leadership, because the critique was that she was kind of nowhere in terms of her public presence. Her argument was, she'd gone away to do some big thinking about the party. And as she told us on Newscast, make sure it survived as a financially viable concern. And Robert Jenrick was doing social media videos and chasing fare dodgers on the London Underground, etc., etc. The argument that some make within the Conservative fold is that, in their view, Robert Jenrick didn't have a great autumn. Some felt that his party conference speech was, as one put it, a bit of a joke. You might remember he was waving around
with a wig.
Judge's wig and whatever. And so goes the argument of some, as I say, including some who liked him and had backed him, that Kemi Badenoch found her mojo and found her kind of zeal, if you like, in the job. And the view of Conservatives across the piece was that they were really impressed with her performance in the autumn, both the conference speech and then her Prime Minister's Questions performances. So arguably, the sense that Robert Jenrick's rise to the Conservative leadership was, if not inevitable, then highly likely and could come pretty soon. The likelihood of that had dialed down, it felt, a bit. Now, Mr. Jenrick argues this conversation with Nigel Farage had been going on since September, so including at the time that he was waving that wig around, etc., etc. Now, people might think, oh, well, how come it took him however long that is ago, 4 or 5 months? And there's a live question about, at what point was he certain, and do you not go at that point? And clearly, it would appear he was not certain this morning until Kemi Badenoch gave him a sort of shove out of the door. I think it is also worth acknowledging on a human level. I think I've said this before in Newscast, but it's worth saying again. Most people in politics at Westminster have an association and a longevity of association with their political party that will be longer than their marriage to their spouse, even if they've been married for 20, 30, 40 years. Because so many politicos have been members of their party since they were teenagers. That was the case with Robert Jenrick, a self-deprecating remark about being one of the only Tories in Wolverhampton when he was a teenager in the late 1990s. So I think, to be fair to those who choose to defect, it is a massive thing to do on a human psychological level, as well as all of the fraying of friendships that goes with it, alongside that kind of battle around in your own mind around how you see the world and how your party might be changing or how you are changing. And Robert Jenrick's long made an argument about how his politics has been on something of a journey. And I remember that. I covered his by-election in Newark in Nottinghamshire in 2014, where, there was that label about Robert Jenrick suggesting that, he didn't really believe in much, didn't really have much to say, was seen as a classic Cameroonian Conservative. He argues that when he went into the Home Office, he was, if you like, radicalised about how, in his view, government doesn't work, and in particular the immigration system is a farce. And so, yeah, quite the journey for him sitting there just a few hours ago as we record, saying he wants Nigel Farage to be the next Prime Minister, and how that relationship works. And as I say, what role he is given, and what does the future look like for reform beyond Nigel Farage. We're getting ahead of ourselves here, but, he's a big and substantial figure who we know has had previous leadership ambitions and a desire to lead his country. So all of those sort of fascinating questions tumbling towards us.
And then a few hours ago, when we were recording the first episode of Newscast on Thursday, the 15th of January, we were speculating about what's the headline that you could come up with that's a pun on a detective name for Kemi Badenoch's detective work that she did to work out that Robert Jenrick was going to defect. We had a suggestion from Newscast producer Miranda. You could say the Conservative Party's gone from Broadchurch to Unhappy Valley.
That's very good.
And also Wayne from Waterlooville says, how about Inspector Montel Badenoch?
That's quite good, Wayne.
And the BBC Control Room, who are our colleagues who helped us go live on the BBC News channel at lunchtime today, they said, Kemi Badenoch. Boom. Very good.
Yeah, very good, very good. But yeah, I mean, that's everything about today, from that grainy video that Kemi Badenoch had rattled off rather quickly at home this morning before she had to dash to the airport to fly to Scotland, because she's been doing some campaigning ahead of the Scottish elections, to Nigel Farage, also on the road and then flying back to London. I mean, yeah, just incredible. And the thing that I'm desperate to try and find out, even though it's kind of trivial in the grand scheme of things, but it is part of the story clearly part of this story, is precisely what was the chain of events that flushed this out. Even though you might think it's sort of classic Westminster tittle-tattle, it has consequence around what's been rushed, what has not been properly thought through as a result of the tactics of DCI Badenoch or whatever name we're going for.
Kemi Badenoch is my winner. Right, Chris, well, you're obviously my winner because it's great to hear your analysis of such a big moment. So thank you very much.
Ta-ra, thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast, your second helping on Thursday the 15th of January and your 2000th helping overall. Thank you for listening either today or for the last few years. We'll be back with another episode very soon.
I've just thought, when will our 2026 episode
in
be? About
26
a fortnight
episodes'
or
time.
Yeah, good answer. Yeah.
All right, bye.
Bye.